What you just heard was the last appearance of what I consider the idée fixe from Rita Stroll's Grand Sonate Dramatique, Titus and Bernice. My name is Milo Nieves. I'm very excited to be here, and I thank you all for showing up. I also need to extend a special thanks to Dr. Park as well. I would not be able to put this on without her, so thank you. The Grand Sonate Dramatique is an unusual piece of music in that it's a programmatic sonata for cello and piano, specifically based on Racine's 17th century play, Bernice. So each of the four movements of the sonata is meant to depict a different scene in the play. Rita Stroll prefaces each movement with a quote either from the play or a description that she wrote herself to set the scene. Unfortunately, we have very little information about this piece's history, and because this type of programmatic literature is really unusual in the cello repertoire, that raises questions, at least for me. The biggest one being, why did Rita Stroll write this piece? And after extensive research, we still really don't know. We don't have any quotes from her talking about her motivation for writing it. But I do have a hypothesis, which is that she wanted to write opera, but lived in a society that considered opera inappropriate for women to write. So her response to that was to write in a hybrid chamber genre meant to function as opera. Now, in keeping with the tradition of French grand opera, this sonata is long. It's about 40 minutes. So we're going to be taking a concentrated look at that piece today. We'll be focusing on some of the stylistic features that aim to fuse that operatic genre with chamber music. And although I see many musical influences in this piece, from Wagner to Berlioz, Saint-Saëns, we're going to focus on two today. Hector Berlioz, whose use of idée fixe for narrative development impacted how Stroll chooses to portray her story, and Frédéric Chopin, who loved opera but never wrote it, and instead brought bel canto writing into his piano melodies. And I think we'll see the influence of that in her own work. So to understand why Stroll thought she couldn't write opera, we need to look at some of the gendered attitudes of the Belle Époque. So in the late 19th century, there was a surge of anti-feminist rhetoric, primarily in response to a small feminist movement also happening at the time. There were many male, quote-unquote, experts on women's health and nature, who wrote extensively about what was appropriate behavior for women. We're talking lectures and books and pamphlets, the whole thing. Notably, Henri Marion created a lecture series arguing that science had proven women to be ill-adapted to rational thought. And his argument was that a hallmark of an advanced and progressive civilization was the maintenance of firm gender boundaries. So unfortunately, this type of rhetoric was prevalent in the society around her. Now, how did this specifically apply to women and music? Broad societal attitudes in Europe at this time regarded music composition as a masculine art. So even though music was considered one of the most emotional art forms possible, it was also thought that you needed logic and reason to channel these emotions effectively. See the previous slide. And it was widely believed that women didn't have this logic. In addition, genres performed in the public sphere, namely the symphony and the opera, were considered inappropriate for women to write. And part of that was because it was not appropriate for women to be seen in public. Men and women were meant to inhabit separate spheres. And then building on that, for opera specifically, the amount of unsupervised contact a woman would have had with numerous men to put on an opera production, conductor and the orchestra, everything, that would also have been considered wildly inappropriate. In addition to that, we have the idea that it wasn't proper for women to write music that was too virile or boisterous or masculine, which the symphony and opera were considered. So thus, salon music was synonymous with women's music, and that was what they were generally allowed to write, or what was considered appropriate, I should say. So let's see an example of what one critic said about one of Rita Stroll's orchestral works. He said, "It's a good little work, neat and tidy in the case of Madame Stroll, who's not without a certain knowledge of orchestration and composition. But it has that puerility of imagination and incurable insignificance of thought, which are the defining features of music composed by amateurs. For gentlemen, one might say that it's better to amuse oneself this way than just spend time in a cafe. But for ladies, let's honestly admit that spinning is a more useful occupation, and certainly no uglier. So let's get a brief look at Rita Stroll's life, which will further help us understand this composition. She was born Amy Marie Marguerite Mercedes Rita La Rousse Lavillette, which is a mouthful. It's no wonder she changed it. Her parents were supportive of her music education. Her father was an amateur cellist, and her mother was one of few women during this time making a professional career as a painter. This is actually one of her paintings. Rita Stroll studied piano at the Paris Conservatory, but unfortunately, women were not allowed to study composition there at this time. So instead, she studied privately with Adrienne Barthes, everything from analysis and composition, as well as fugue and counterpoint. So looking at her compositions throughout her life, we see a growing fascination with opera. The early part of Rita Stroll's career is mostly chamber music. Notably, we have her first piano trio in G minor, which was presented to the National Society of Music by Saint-Saëns in 1886. So not only was he aware of her and her music, he was highly complimentary of it. In this early period, we do also see her first large programmatic piece, a lyric symphony based on the story of Joan of Arc. Unfortunately, the score seems to have suffered the same fate as Joan of Arc. She burned it. In the middle part of Rita Stroll's career, we see her start experimenting with programmatic music, but in genres that were still considered acceptable for women to write. So, for example, we see 3 programmatic string sonatas, including the cello sonata that we're looking at today. And it isn't until she left Paris around 1908 that we begin seeing experimentation with opera and symphonic literature. By 1908, Rita Stroll had met and married her second husband, who was a pianist, an artist, and a Wagner enthusiast. So they left Paris to create a theater modeled after Wagner's Bayreuth, specifically to perform Stroll's mystic opera cycles. We have this quote from Rita talking about it. Together with my husband, we started work on our theater. We named it Le Grange, and thought of it as a safe refuge where we could preserve the best of ourselves and our art without fear of attack from outside. So at this point, she's created a safe space to write and perform her own opera. Ultimately, Rita Stroll wrote 3 mystic opera cycles based on Christian, Celtic, and Hindu myths. And like Wagner, she wrote her own libretti. We don't know to what extent they were performed at La Grange, unfortunately. We do know they would have been very expensive productions to put on, massive orchestras and set designs. So ultimately, this experiment with her theater failed. She and her husband ended up selling it. Then she divorced her second husband and retired to the French countryside to live with her daughter, which is where she spent the rest of her life. And she really didn't write any music after that. She died in 1941, and unfortunately, like with many women composers, her music died with her. We're just lucky that within the past 10 years or so, there's been a resurgence of interest in Rita Stroll and her music, and we can study it now. So we're going to switch gears now and talk about Hector Berlioz and how his concept of idée fixe influenced Rita Stroll. But first, just a little bit of background about the plot of this story that she's portraying. So as I mentioned, Rita Stroll chose Racine's play Bernice as the subject of her sonata. And in this play, Titus has just returned to Rome. He's about to become the new emperor. He's brought Bernice with him, who's the queen of Palestine, and he intends to marry her. Unfortunately, there's a problem, and that's that Roman law says he can't marry a foreigner. So the play focuses on Titus's struggle to choose between his duty to Rome and his love for Bernice. And spoiler alert, he chooses Rome. Now, I don't know about you, but the drama of doomed tragic love seems pretty operatic to me, and in fact it was made into an opera in 1714 by Antonio Caldara. But if we're approaching this storyline from the perspective of 19th century French opera, there's one unusual feature in it, that no one dies in the end, and Bernice doesn't kill herself when she's rejected. She also doesn't wait to be sent away by Titus. Instead, she exerts what power she has in that moment and leaves right away. Personally, I don't think that Rita Stroll chose this story on a whim. This is just my conjecture, but I think Stroll felt a certain kinship with Bernice, a woman pitted against a society that disapproved of her. And I don't think it's a coincidence that she chose a story with a woman who exerts what power she has over her destiny, just as Rita Stroll was trying to do in her own life. So let's quickly refresh our memories about Hector Berlioz and idée fixe. Berlioz coined the term idée fixe to describe a musical idea used obsessively, and specifically it describes the main theme in his Symphonie Fantastique. That theme reoccurs in all 5 movements, but changes to fit the narrative context of each movement. So it takes on sort of a waltz quality in the ball scene and a grotesque dance at the Witches' Sabbath, for example. It's kind of a clever way of showing the narrative development in a story. In studying Rita Stroll's Grande Sonate Dramatique, I found a melody that operates similarly, so we'll be talking about that theme next, what I consider to be her idée fixe, I should say. So I opened this lecture by playing Stroll's most appassionato version of this idée fixe, which happens at the end of the 4th movement. At this point, she has transformed that melody using rhythmic augmentation to give kind of a sense of grandeur to the couple's final moments together at the end of the story. And it's almost as if this moment is suspended in time. But let's look at this melody in other forms. This is the first appearance of the idée fixe in the 1st movement. You can see it here in the section labeled moderato. Now, like Berlioz, this melody returns in every movement, except the 2nd, which we'll talk about separately. And like Berlioz, how the melody appears changes as the story progresses, as with the rhythmic augmentation at the end of the story. So let's hear a little of that melody to remind ourselves of what it sounds like. Now, Rita Stroll left no indication as to what this idée fixe represents, but to me, it's clearly meant to be a love theme. Interestingly, though, it's very syncopated, and there's no sense of strong downbeats until the end of the phrase. On the one hand, it gives that kind of a flowing, breathless quality to the melody. It's very romantic. At the same time, though, the rhythmic ambiguity creates this sense of instability. And it's almost as if Rita Stroll is informing the audience that the romance itself is not stable. It's foreshadowing to what we know ultimately is doomed love. And if you'll notice, underneath this melody, we also have a syncopated rhythmic pattern in the piano, which adds to that instability. And you'll hear this piano accompaniment come back as well, not always just with the idée fixe. Let's take a step back even further and look at the introduction that precedes this idée fixe. So Stroll prefaces this 1st movement with a quote from Racine's play, and it says, "Titus's uncertainty, his passion, his hope to see Rome relent, though Rome, by a law that nothing can change, accepts with its blood no other blood." So remember that Roman law says that Titus can't marry a foreigner. So the focus of this movement is on Titus's struggle to choose between duty and love. So this introduction is meant to set up the uncertainty in that decision. The movement opens with 3 measures of this kind of piano tremolo, clearly meant to be a drum roll, and during this drum roll we can picture a curtain rising. And then when the cello enters in measure 4, you'll notice it's marked recitative. Can we hear a little bit of that? So that slinking, descending chromatic line gives a feeling of uncertainty to the opening. We're really not sure what's happening harmonically until the piano enters with that E major chord in measure 8, resolving the tension. It's very mysterious sounding, and it's, in my opinion, meant to represent Titus's own uncertainty in his decision. A little too far. Note that the piano responds to this gesture with a similar recitative figure, then adds to that uncertainty by playing what sounds to me like a question in the form of a triplet figure in measures 12 and 15. So that triplet figure comes back in the 3rd movement, so try to remember it. What is this question asking? I think it's something like, what do I do? Again, uncertainty. So this introduction sits in this place of uncertainty until around measure 21, and then you're going to hear the color change. It's as if Titus has started thinking about Bernice, and everything starts to feel all right. And it's that transition that leads into the first Idée fixe. So let's listen to that entire introduction, recitative and Idée fixe now. Because Stroll is depicting this conflict within Titus, fairly soon after the Idée Fixe, she introduces a second theme to put in direct conflict with it. And again, we don't have any information about what this is meant to represent, but I call it the Rome theme. This theme returns at several points throughout the sonata, but not as often as the Idée Fixe. You'll note that it has a rigid rhythmic quality, which contrasts the Idée Fixe's flowing quality. And that helps give it a kind of a militaristic feel. The dotted rhythm here is also one often used to portray trumpet calls. The second part of this theme is more legato. You'll see where the cello comes in there. More legato, melodic, has a grand royal feel, meant to depict the expanse of the Roman Empire. We'll play that for you now. Hopefully, you noticed a little bit of that Idée Fixe at the end of that excerpt. Notice, though, that she didn't return to the original slower tempo, so there's more of an agitated feeling to it. The piano accompaniment, however, does change there to these arpeggiated figures, clearly meant to sound like a harp. So we're seeing Stroll literally put these themes in conflict with each other. Let's look at one more instance, though, of Idée Fixe before moving on. This time one where she uses it to build tension. So notice here she's using that same Idée Fixe rhythm, but this time opens with a tritone between the first two notes instead of a perfect fourth. And I think we can all agree that tritones immediately suggest tension. Underneath, she has rigid repeating 16th notes, again suggesting military and Rome. So again, she's combining elements of both of these themes to portray that literal conflict. In this case, I think what you'll hear is it seems like Rome is trying to overtake that Idée Fixe, trying to overtake the love of Titus and Bernice. And I think by the end of this excerpt, you'll hear that that dotted eighth rhythm wins out in the end. Let's listen to that. So hopefully you've noticed how she's able to use both of these themes and kind of mix and match features to show the literal conflict. This won't be the last time that we hear that idée fixe either. So let's talk about the second movement now, which kind of exists separately from the rest of the story. From a programmatic standpoint, this movement does nothing to further the action of the story. She prefaces the movement with this following quote: "Bernice's apartments, her ladies, maids, attempt to divert her with their songs and dances." So because the action of the story isn't moving forward, there's no appearance of idée fixe or Rome. Instead, this movement serves two purposes. First, it's a nod to divertissement, which, as the name implies, creates a diversion or a break in the action of the story. So for thinking historically, a divertissement would generally consist of bursts of song and dance on stage. They were made popular by Jean-Baptiste Lully and became the trademark of French opera. By the 19th century, including a ballet was a requirement of French opera. So Stroll's inclusion of dance is a nod to this requirement and creates a break in the action, as divertissement would. It also serves a second purpose, which is to emphasize Bernice's exotic origins. And then in highlighting her otherness, she's also highlighting one of the biggest conflicts in the story. Because remember, Rome has an issue with Bernice being a foreigner. And it was very common practice at the time in French opera to include a song or dance specifically to reinforce the exotic nature of a character or a place. Exoticism was a prevalent feature of 19th century French opera. I think we can all think of a couple examples off the top of our head. For me, I always think of Carmen by Bizet or Samson and Delilah by Saint-Saëns. And exoticism uses stereotypes to portray people or places or cultures that were perceived as distant or other. These features, though, were not based on anything actually coming from the culture they're depicting, whether that's on stage, like with the art, or the music, as we'll talk about. Musically speaking, they were relying on the audience to pick up something that just sounded strange to their ear. So while this was exoticism was a common feature in opera, it wasn't just opera. We have here a good example of that, the Saint-Saëns Piano Concerto No. 5, which has the subtitle Egyptian. And that title, in part, comes from the opening of the second movement, which we'll listen to here. Notice that relentless rhythm in the strings. It doesn't stop for anything. That's exoticism. Of course, the scalar pattern as well. I don't think I even need to say anything about that. It's a really great piece. So the opening of the second movement is meant to be a dance, but it's written in 3/8, not 3/4, so it's more of a scherzo than a waltz. However, we have this striking bit of syncopation that returns throughout the movement that makes the dance feel a little bit off kilter. So while it's a dance, it's not exactly the one that the audience is expecting. So when we play this, definitely listen for those bits of syncopation and any hemiola rhythms. Those will hopefully stand out. One of the most striking moments in the movement comes in the second section, which is meant to be the singing portion. Notice that Stroll sets the section with a rhythmic ostinato in the piano left hand. And above that rhythm, we have a singing chromatic melody in the cello, which is harmonized in parallel motion in the piano. striking to hear. This is non-functional chromatic harmony, meaning the chords aren't moving to a cadence or any type of resolution. And this would have been something really common in Impressionist music, but it was not common now. And I think it's really easy to dismiss this type of chromaticism as a modern audience. It doesn't sound that unusual to us, but to an audience of the time, it definitely would have caught their attention and signaled other. So listen for those features while we play about half of that second movement for you. So let's switch gears and talk now about Chopin and the influence of bel canto melody writing. Hopefully you know Chopin was good friends with Bellini, and he loved opera but never wrote it. So instead he worked to bring bel canto writing into his own melodies. We see this beautiful singing quality in a lot of his music, but especially the nocturnes. Chopin established himself as the master of the nocturne, and through his development of that genre, it became kind of an instrumental version of the aria. And obviously he does this with those soaring singing melodies, but he still uses the piano's strengths to his advantage and writes virtuosic runs and ornamentation that are not singable for the human voice. So they are very uniquely piano arias. Hopefully you've seen kind of the influence of that singing quality in some of Rita Stroll's music, but we're going to see a better balance between this type of bel canto writing and virtuosity in the third movement of the sonata. Stroll prefaces the third movement with this quote: "Bernice knows all. In spite of his love, Titus sacrifices her to the empire." And Bernice says, "I'm restless, I run, listless, despondent. My strength abandons me, and rest kills me." So clearly at this point, she has found out that Titus is going to reject her and send her away. So the third movement functions as the tragic aria of this story. And it features many of the elements we've discussed today. It's also going to showcase a very obvious connection to Chopin. So we're going to close by playing the entire third movement of the sonata, but I want to remind you of some elements that you should listen for. You're going to hear the Ide fix again, this time giving way to these appassionato runs, which hopefully you should hear some of that Chopin-style virtuosity, but in more of a cello way. You're going to hear the dotted eighth rhythms, this time descending rather than ascending in the Rome theme, which to me feels like a depiction of Bernice crying. There will be a pause, followed by another recitative, similar to the one in the first movement, and like in the third movement, it will be followed by that questiony triplet figure. And at the very end of this movement, you'll hear one last ominous-sounding Rome theme, which is definitely foreshadowing the separation of the lovers in the following movement. And it's a way for Stroll to tell the audience that Rome has won in the end. I also want to highlight that there's a striking similarity between the opening of this movement and the opening of Chopin's Prelude, Opus 28, number 4. You can't deny that influence. So let's hear a little bit of that prelude just to get it in your ear first. I just want to close by putting one more thing in your mind as you listen. I mentioned earlier that I'm operating under the hypothesis that Stroll felt a connection or a sense of kinship with Bernice. So I hear this movement not just as Bernice's lament, but Rita Stroll's as well. A lament for everything she's lost in a society that doesn't fully accept her or her music, and the pain that comes with trying to conform to that society. Yes.
What happens in the last movement?
Oh my gosh, that could be its own lecture recital, to be honest. There's like introduction of new themes, there's, you know, or do you mean programmatically? Because programmatically speaking, they depart ways and it's very tragic.
I mean, you omitted it from this lecture recital.
That is not true. The opening of this lecture featured an Ide fix from the fourth movement.
But what happens?
What, in which, programmatically, yes. They depart ways.
And does it end?
It ends dramatically and tragically. We do get the main melody from this third movement shows up at the very, very, very end. So I think it's meant to be like the departure theme, like the departing of ways. So that is one notable feature, but yeah, it's very dramatic. Yes.
I have a question about, I fully buy how you deal with the concept of the Ide fix,
Mhm.
and particularly as it relates to Berlioz. Another person who wanted to write for opera and wasn't successful in that way, but for very different reasons.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about if you see any Wagnerian.
Oh my gosh.
I think that's a good question about, you know, why not
Yes.
leitmotif and why Ide fix?
Yes, there's so much Wagner influence. I mean, if you're looking at the chromaticism and like all that uncertainty, and there's like a million different little motifs that come back a million different times and ways. And if I had more time, I would love to sit down and like take a highlighter and you know, highlight all the individual themes, because I think there's actually quite a bit of that, and it just, you know, hasn't been studied. But yeah, definitely, it's all Wagner, I think.
See it in the document?
What was that?
We'll see it in the document.
Yes, that is exactly. Oh yeah, just the recitative alone. That's so Wagner.
Tristan.
Yeah, exactly.
Isolde.
Exactly. So, very opera, very Wagner.
Just one more. Is there a question? Could we talk a little bit more about these doomed relationships where it's like love versus duty?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm thinking in a larger version of this project. If you talk about, I mean, obviously there's a grand French tradition
Yeah.
in French opera.
Yes.
But is that something that you get into? I like how you connected to the sort of autobiographical side of things.
Yeah.
But so many of these French operas, I'm thinking of like Armide or something better than where you're dealing with these women characters who get foregrounded,
Yes.
even though they're the tragic other characters.
Yes.
So is that something you're interested in?
Oh, absolutely. I think the struggle with this document is that it's going to be much longer than it probably should be. But yes, I think it's really important to talk about that tradition in French opera, especially if we're coming at it from the perspective that this is meant to be that. It's definitely connected and related. So hopefully, yes. Not a single question. Thorough research, what can I say?
Okay, I have a question. When was the last time that this opera was programmed somewhere? Do you know? Or
This-
does it get programmed very often in modern theater?
This sonata has been enjoying a resurgence of interest as of late, so I've definitely been seeing it crop up on, you know, it's been recently recorded by several people and programmed and things like that. The difficulty, of course, is that it's long, and nobody wants to learn it, I think. But yeah, I mean, it's like I said, growing in interest, so I don't know about in America as much. France, definitely, because she's French, so maybe it just needs to get performed here, we'll see. Yes, Dr. Tappan.
Could you talk a little bit about Ridderström's other works? I know you mentioned some, but you know, have you encountered them? Have you listened to them? What impression do you have for music? How did it
her music's very, very interesting. She got really into mysticism after her first husband died, so that was several years after this sonata was written. So this is still largely like romantic and whatever. So you definitely see like early impressionist kind of styles in her symphonic music. I don't know what the opera is like because nobody has recorded it, and I don't know if the scores exist. What I have heard about the scores is that they're about this tall, like they're massive. Like she didn't do anything by half. But yeah, and then I think pretty much all of her orchestral music is programmatic. And she has quite a bit of vocal music as well that is, again, all programmatic. So a huge interest in the dramatic side of music, I guess. Yes, Sophie.
Yes, I was going to ask a similar question to Dr. Tappan. Yeah, I'm curious, like, where this fit in her timeline, like before the opera, the attempted opera, or after. Could you clarify that a little more? I didn't catch it.
I'm sorry, ask that one more time.
Like, where in the timeline of her music does this fit?
Oh, this sonata,
Just
yes.
to clarify.
So this is in her, what I would call her middle period, which is, well, actually there's conflicting dates as to when this was written, either 1892 or 1898. And so she didn't start writing opera until like after 1908, approximately, the later half of her career. This is the experimental stage.
Why
Yes.
did she write for cello?
What was that?
Why did she write for cello?
Why did she write for cello? I wish we had a definitive answer about that. Again, there's like, actually, she wrote a lot throughout her life, like obviously music, but she kept journals and things like that. But we don't like have access to that information, so I don't know what her reason, like what she would have said. I mean, I think there's what some would call a weak argument for using the cello because of its connection to the human voice. And if we look at this entire sonata, she uses the full range of the cello, which she couldn't do if she picked any other string instrument, really. So if you're thinking of the string family, this is the instrument that makes the most sense. But as with a lot of things about the sonata, we really don't know. I would love to find out. Yes?
Can you explain how you first learned about Rectital and why this research intrigues you so much?
Oh yeah, this is the culmination of like 6 years of fascination with this piece. I found this kind of by chance. My focus and interest has always been in music by women composers, largely because of a lack of exposure to them in my undergrad. And it occurred to me that that was weird one day. So I started prowling the internet and forums and whatever, and somebody had literally just recorded this piece. And I listened to it and was immediately enthralled by it. Her melodic writing is very beautiful. It's way too long, but it's a great piece. And then I would like forget about the piece for a few months, and then I'd like rediscover it and get obsessed with it all over again. So, you know, it's really just been on this journey with me since then. And then it occurred to me one day that like, well, this is basically opera. And I find it really strange that nobody has made that connection. But I think it's just because nobody has studied it. I think if you look at it for 5 minutes, it's really, really obvious. So I don't know, it was sort of by accident, and I just get obsessed with things, and I will probably continue to be obsessed with it for another 20 years or whatever. We'll see.